So you're playing Genshin, you're doing a 10 pull, and while you don't get a 5-star, you do get 4-star Chongyun. Now, what do you get with Chongyun besides Shenhe's nephew? Well, Chongyun is a Claymore-wielding cryo user who is actually the original on-field character for the national team. And in this video, we're going to look at the basics of Chongyun. Now, if you do like my content and my videos, make sure that you like, comment, subscribe, follow, all of that fun stuff. Make sure you catch me on some lives, and I do post my schedule, my stream schedule in the Discord and like on TikTok stories. I've tried to do it to YouTube board a couple of times, and sometimes the file size is too big and it takes forever. Now, yes, for this video, I am going to be using the trial Chongyun. I do have C5, but he's only level 20 out of 40. I am about to start working on a bunch of the cryo characters once I finish Baiju, but I didn't want to use a level 20 character, a level 40 character for this video. So we are in here doing the trial, and I am okay with that because, as you can see here, the characters that they have given us for this trial is the national team, which was one of Chongyun's original good teams way back when he was first released. And in fact, all of the national teams that have popped up with Child and Raiden National or Rational Team have kind of stemmed from this original national team. So first, we're going to look at his normal attacks. I mean, his normal attacks are going to be doing physical damage. They're going to be normal. He's not the slowest Claymore normal attacker. Like, I think Dia is really slow, but he's also not the fastest. I believe that Eula has the fastest normal attacks for all Claymore users. It might be Mawika now. Mawika might have taken that with how she works. Before Natlin, I believe that Eula was the fastest on normal attacks, but his are pretty decently paced, and then his charge attack are going to be the Beyblade version where he just kind of spins around. Now, if we look at his skill, it's going to do a couple of things. First, it's going to do an instance of AoE cryo damage, as well as putting this field up wherever it hits. Now, this field is going to give your on-field character cryo infusion if they are a sword, claymore, or pole arm wielding character. We just happen to have all three of these in this team. So Chongyun gets cryo infusion, Xingqiu and Bennett get cryo infusion, and Zhang Ling also get cryo infusion if they're on the field. Now, the skill does work with both of his passives. The first passive being that a sword, claymore, or pole arm wielding character within the field of his skill will have their normal attack speed increased by 8%, meaning his own personal normal attack speed is going to increase, making it to where it doesn't feel as slow. You can definitely feel that he is attacking faster. His second passive is going to be that when the field from his skill expires, it disappears, another blade will be summoned, another spirit blade will be summoned, dealing AoE cryo damage, but also the enemies hit by this are going to have their cryo resistance dropped by 10% for 8 seconds, meaning that you can kind of follow up the end of his skill with his burst to increase the amount of damage that his burst does. Now, because that passive does increase his normal attack speed, it means that he can be our on-field driver or on-field damage dealer for this national team, but also in like a freeze team, because he can do some freeze shatter stuff, which is actually kind of fun to do with him as well. In this particular team, in the national team, we are going to be applying cryo to enemies, so that way we want Zhang Ling to be getting the melts, because she is going to be doing more damage than Chongyun getting the melts. And then, of course, we're going to have Xingqiu in there to even possibly get some vaporize reactions, free some enemies. We have a lot of reactions going on in these teams, which is one of the reasons why national teams are so fun. Now, I did say that at the end of his skill, it's going to make the enemies weaker to cryo because of that passive, and then we should be kind of following it up with his burst. So let's take a look at his burst. His burst is just going to be an instance of AoE cryo damage where it's going to summon 3 blades that are going to drop from the sky, dealing this AoE cryo damage, and that's really it. It's just a damage dealing burst. There are no passives, there's nothing off field, there's no buffing, nothing. It is just going to be that it is another instance of AoE cryo damage. Now, this does do a fair good amount of damage, so we can make use of having buffs, and one of the artifacts and weapons that we're going to talk about, you can actually kind of build them as a burst damage dealer, but that's really all it is. It's just going to be an instance of cryo damage, nothing too fancy. Now, speaking of artifacts and weapons, let's look at them. In this particular trial, they do have them on Blizzard Strayer, and while the 2-piece I would say is going to be good, the 4-piece in this team, not so much, and let's talk about why. Blizzard Strayer 2-piece is going to increase your cryo damage bonus, which is going to be very good. He'll always be able to use that. The 4-piece, when a character, and when it says a character, it means this equipping character. This was before Genshin started wording the artifacts a little bit more strictly. When this character attacks an opponent affected by cryo, their crit rate is increased by 20%. If the opponent is frozen, crit rate is increased by an additional 20%. So in a freeze team, this is going to be very good. In something like the national team, where Zhang Ling is going to be melting the enemies and they're not going to have cryo on them, the 2-piece Blizzard Strayer will be good, but not the 4-piece. If you're running him in a national team, then doing 2-piece Blizzard Strayer and 2-piece attack like Glad is going to be better than the 4-piece because he'll be able to get the cryo damage bonus and the attack from Glad, and the 4-piece he won't be able to fully make use of on Blizzard Strayer. Now, if you are using him as like your on-field driver, then you can possibly use 4-piece Glad because he will like the attack, and then you are going to be using his normal charge attacks a lot with that cryo infusion. So he might be able to use the 4-piece Glad, but I'd probably just stick with 2-piece. Now, I do think that you could possibly use something like Marshmallow Hunter, especially if you're using him in a Farina freeze team. But at that point, you almost would probably just want to go Blizzard Strayer instead of Marshmallow Hunter, just in case you don't have a healer that can kind of keep up with the draining to fluctuate it enough. I'm curious as to how much better, or if better, Marshmallow compared to something like Blizzard Strayer would be, because they're both going to increase crit rate. In this freeze team, it's going to come down to whether or not you have a healer to compensate for the Farina draining the HP enough to have all 36 stacks, and you would get more crit rate from Blizzard Strayer, especially if you had Cryo Resonance. So I'd be very interested to see them kind of side by side in a comparison. Now back to some more standard builds. You do have something like Emblem, where if you want to use him as like a burst damage, kind of in a quick swap team, where you would kind of use his skill to give somebody else the cryo infusion, bring him on the field, use his burst after that the skill has ended and the enemy is weaker to cryo, then bring him on, use his burst, put his skill back up whenever it's ready, and then take him right back off so that way somebody else can get the cryo infusion. This would be an option to use in a team like that, where you're kind of swapping around your characters a lot and giving that cryo infusion to somebody else, just using him for the cryo infusion and burst damage. And then of course, if you want to build like support, you could put Noblesse on him, where it is going to increase the damage of his burst, but then using his burst is going to give an all party attack buff after using his burst. This would be another team where you would be using his skill to give somebody else the cryo infusion and the normal attack speed, and then this would just allow him to buff them. You aren't necessarily worried about how much damage his burst does. It do a little bit more because of the 2-piece, but you're mainly going to be using him to give the attack speed to somebody else, cryo infusion to somebody else, and this attack buff to somebody else. Now for the main stats on these artifacts, depending on what you're doing, you're going to be running an attack sands or an ER sands, a cryo goblet, and then a crit rate or crit damage circlet, depending on what you need more of. Now for weapons, you do have a couple of different options, mainly depending on the kind of build that you're going to be giving him, right? If you want him to do damage, then you do have Wolf's Gravestone, which is going to be a very, very good option because it's going to just give him a ton of attack, which is actually going to be really, really good for him. Then, of course, you do have something like Serpent Spine, which is going to increase his crit rate, and then it is going to increase his damage in the passive. You do have good old-fashioned Prototype Archaic, which I believe is going to actually be his best like free-to-play option, where it's going to give him a bunch of attack, and then it's going to have an extra instance or possibility of doing damage based on his attack. If you're running him in a support or going to be on something like Emblem, then you do have, of course, the ER weapons, which are going to be like Favonius or Sacrificial. And I believe that Sacrificial might actually be better because of that skill cooldown reset. You'll be able to use it more often, giving cryo infusion to somebody else that would be your main on-field damage dealer. So this would allow him to have more uptime on his skill because of that passive. You also do have something like Tidal Shadow, which I do wonder how this would go on him. It's going to do attack percent, and then after being healed, it's going to increase the attack even more. So if you're running him in a team with Benny or any healer for that matter, then really this would just increase his attack a ton, and it is craftable. So you could just get this up to 48% in the passive, giving him a ton of attack as long as you heal him, which I mean, you're going to be running a healer, especially if you're running him with like Benny, then this would definitely be able to increase his attack. And how long this buff in the passive works actually goes really well with his skill. And then of course you do have something like Beacon, which is just going to be really, really good on every Claymore user, where you're going to get a ton of crit rate on there, and then you're going to get attack and attack buffs in the passives. The HP doesn't matter as much, but that double attack buff will be very, very good. And while we're talking about it, Aqua Amaru can actually be really good for him. Of course, you would have him in a party where you're going to want to have a bunch of burst cost, a really, really high burst cost for the team to get the full use out of this, but you can definitely use it. And I actually really like how it kind of looks on him. It looks pretty good too. And you can even use something like Lithic Blade on him, which is going to be get up his attack, but it's also going to increase his attack and crit rate based on how many people from Leeway you have in his party. So in the national team, you have him, Xingqiu, and Xiangling, all from Leeway, giving him 21% attack buff and 9 crit rate, which can be very, very useful for him. He's one of the few Claymore users that can actually use this weapon pretty well. Now, he may even be able to use something like the Talking Stick. This is going to get up crit rate and it's going to get up attack if they're affected by Pyro, which if you have C6 Benny, you can be affected by Pyro whenever you use his burst, but I don't know if that overrides his skill infusion. I think it does. I think that Benny C6 would override his skill infusion. Actually, I'm going to go check that out. I'm going to put it right here, right now, whatever you're seeing right now. But the being affected by Hydro to increase his elemental damage bonus, Xingqiu can definitely do that. So that way you can get that there. But if Benny C6 does override his Cryo Infusion, then I would be much more hesitant to try something like this. Now that's going to be it for this video. Cookie has green hair. I have green hair here, but pink hair in real life, and I'll see you in the next one.